Welcome everyone to Fix the System, Not the Kids, provided by the PA Care Partnership in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. At any time during our presentation, please type your questions into the Q&A feature, which you will find by running your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen. Today's moderators are Kelsey Leonard, myself, Jamal Ford, and Nancy Massey from the PA Care Partnership. Dr. Jackson will be speaking to us from her studio. In order to enjoy the best visualization of this presentation, please set Zoom to presenter view. If you need help, please see the chat for instructions.
Speaker view.
It's all yours, Nancy.
Okay, just wanted to make one correction to what Jamal said. We are selecting speaker view. Okay. Welcome everyone. I am here to introduce our speaker, Dr. Veirdre Jackson. Dr. Jackson has a bachelor's degree from Drexel, a master's in elementary education from Temple, and a doctoral degree from Wilmington University in leadership and innovation. Dr. Jackson is a woman pursuing her purpose, passion, and life's priority to share her belief that all children deserve the best education available. She is an award-winning author, educator, and entrepreneur who is recognized as a leading educational trainer in trauma-informed practices and cultural competence. She is a veteran educator with over 20 years of experience supporting nonprofit and executive leadership. Jamal is going to pin her now, and we are going to turn over the presentation to Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Nancy. I so appreciate the opportunity to connect with you, to be able to share a little bit of a story. I'd like to share a story about a little girl. She's about 5 years old, and regardless of what room she's in, she often feels alone. She often struggles to find a place. And if I could explain this moment in time in her story, she's returning to her kindergarten classroom. And this particular moment is actually a powerful one for her because she's returning right after an incident where she began to recognize and realize that her difference is what was making her feel like an outsider. She's returning to her kindergarten classroom after an incident on the playground the previous day, where she literally was knocked to the ground, kicked and beaten up, the entire time being told that she was a mistake. She survived that moment, and it was now time for her to return to the classroom. In this moment, she's entering into the room and she recognizes that she is afraid. She's again alone. As she enters into this space and eyes are on her, her teacher opens her arms and welcomes her into her arms. Now, why is this important? Because that little girl was me. The time was the early 1970s. And I was one of the very first African-American children allowed into the private school. And in that moment, when it was time for circle time, that teacher, instead of having me join the regular spot around the circle, welcomed me into the middle of her lap. And in her lap, she wrapped her arms around me and sent a message to all of the children who sat in that half circle that day. Now, I know at some point I learned my ABCs. I'm certain of that. But I can tell you more about the fact that I learned in that moment that I belonged, that I was a part of that circle. She didn't have to, in that moment, do that. Because of the times, it could have very easily been something that she shifted to the side. But although I don't remember, I know at some point I learned my ABCs. But in truth, what I do remember is I remember her face. I remember her cat glasses. I remember the white dress she had on that day. And I remember her arms as they wrapped around me. Same little girl. That was me. Fast forward to high school, my senior year. I was oftentimes in one of the higher ranking scores in my classroom, and this was chemistry class. I often got A's. I wasn't a struggling student. And this particular afternoon, he was passing out, again, the results of our chemistry class. And I know you might be shocked, but back then, he listed everyone's scores from top to bottom on a piece of paper by the door as you exited. So in that moment, it was time for me to gain my test back. And again, I had been one of the top ones in the class, had earned an amazing grade in this AP chemistry class. And I don't remember in the moment what it was that kept me from being able to get out of the room with everyone else. But for this particular day, for some reason, I was still gathering my things when all of the other students had left. And in that moment, I took my paper, and as he passed it to me, he said the words, "I don't know why you're working so hard in this class. You could, as pretty as you are, just worry about getting a husband." Yes, he did. That's exactly what he said. And I paused in a moment and I said, no. I took my test and I went home. It was a powerful moment, another bookend moment in my educational experience. Because in that moment, again, I don't remember all of our chemistry lessons, but I remember him. I remember the shirt he had on that day. I remember his long white beard. I remember his pocket protector. I remember how he made me feel in that moment. Now, I don't say that to gain pity or for you to feel sorry for me. I share it because it's true. It's a part of my story. But it didn't hold me back, because the belonging that my kindergarten teacher, and that was almost 50 years ago, I remember how she made me feel the same way I remember how he made me feel. And today, I want us to engage in a conversation around, in this session, can we gain an understanding together on how to shift the responsibility of being resilient from the marginalized to the system that's robbing the brilliance of students from actually tapping into their belonging. I hope we can consider how our current practices, policies, and power impact the emotional, physical, and mental health of students, especially those who are marginalized. And most importantly, I hope that we can identify the role we will take to create and advocate for equitable change. Not just diversity, because the change I'm talking about is a change in ideology, engagement, and agency. Because if you listen to both of those stories, they are stories in which the school began to address the issue of diversity. But what they were missing was the opportunity to address belonging. So I want to pause because I'm not sure that here we go. I wanted to make sure that I was spotlighted and not Nancy. There we go, it shifted. So when we're walking into this conversation together, oftentimes as a consultant, people will ask me to come and jump right into strategy. We want to talk about diversity. We want to talk about cultural competence, and we want to talk about equity. And they want me to share strategies with them. But if we're going to begin this conversation around equity, we have to recognize that equity is not just about strategy. Equity is creating space, belonging, and access for people, their value, their experiences, and their stories. Equity is more than stats. It's more than facts, and it is more than data. Equity is not just a strategy or an action plan. Equity begins as ideology. Ideology is our belief system, the mental models that we create that actually shape our belief system from our experiences, and they drive our desire to play a role and advocate or not. And there's a danger behind not creating space for multiple stories. There's a danger that can happen in mental models that are built from a single story. I want to give you an example. So take a look at this image. And in the chat, what do you think this is an entire picture of? What do you think the whole picture is? Just put your best guesses into the chat. I see them coming in. Tornado, X-ray, fairy moon, wow, cat. Oh, they're really coming in now. They are flying through. Fur, yep, uh-huh. I see hair, yes. Dirt, clouds, wow, fire, wow. They are really streaming through. I use this example in this conversation because this can represent a danger that happens with operating from a single story. We create a narrative for what we think somebody else is. We create an entire story around what we believe to be true. We'll create a label. We'll begin to create identity. We will begin to create a narrative about the possibility based on just one portion of who an individual is, when their whole story is actually this, that there is so much more to an individual, to our students, to those who are in our court systems, to those who are in our foster care systems, for those who are in our welfare systems, for those who are in our communities. There is so much more to their story that if we aren't careful and we begin to put them in a box based on a narrative that we created about them, instead of allowing their full picture to have space and value and presence. When we talk about our narrative, it is a story. It's a story of society. It's our story. It's your story. It's the student's story. It's the story that communities build and create. But the danger of a single story is that it is created often by a dominant normative culture. And it's about the cultural identity or attributes or stereotypes that begin to box students, children, young people in. And then they have to begin to live in that box instead of being able to be all that they are meant to be. When we create a single story or a bias that boxes in the narrative of someone else's story, it shifts them. It shifts their mental perspective of who they are and who they can be. I love this quote by Lori Olhoff. The way we feel about ourselves is shaped by the interactions we have with others. And the interactions we have with others shape how we feel about ourselves. If we aren't intentional about those interactions, they begin to shape not only the view we have of someone, but it begins to. So, but I want to pause because I don't want to give the impression that when I'm talking about shifting the narrative, that it's just about creating a counter narrative that's about hyping kids up or creating opportunities for positive thinking or cheerleading chants or telling them to just work harder or to be nice or to just behave. Those are all directions about how to behave. They're not actually affirmations or opportunity to speak to who they are as a person, to create space for equity. It's an opportunity to recognize that the environment of equity, it has a feeling to it. There's a responsibility that comes along with creating a space of equity that goes beyond performance, that goes beyond trying to manipulate a behavior. Equity, it's an opportunity to create a feeling of value, of respect, creating space for voice, creating space for others to feel cared about, to feel seen. Create and cultivate confidence and agency, even in the face of challenge. Equity creates an opportunity for empowerment, for there to be a chance to be challenged and move forward to achieve a goal. See, equity is I see my place and responsibility in creating societal justice. But before we can talk about equity, I do need us to have a quick conversation around the shaping of race. So in the chat, this question, at what age do you think children begin to think about race? Just drop it in. I see 5. Just drop in the chat. I see 5, 2, 6, 2, 4, 3, 7. Wow, yes, throw them in there. 1, 4, 6, yeah. 8, 1 years old. It's powerful. Thank you for your engagement. I want to unpack something for you based on research. Oftentimes, people are afraid to talk about race with children, and especially in school settings. Many of my clients are either early childhood classrooms or programs, all the way through K-12 environments, and I even have some post-secondary education institutions. But there's a fear about talking about race. They are not too young to talk about race. You see, at birth, babies look equally at the face of all races, but about 3 months of age, babies begin to look more at the faces that match the face of their caregivers. Then, as they get a little bit older, children as young as 2 years old use race to reason about people's behavior. About 30 months, most children use race to begin to choose their playmates. And expressions of racial prejudice often peak at the ages of 4 and 5. Mary Ellen Goodman, after she worked with about 100 Black and white children, in her study, she discovered that ages 3 to 5 reported not only that racial strongly entrenched race-related values and beliefs, and they began as early as 3 to 4 years of age. You see, when we take a look at the research, by kindergarten, children show many of the same racial attitudes that adults hold. They have already learned to associate some groups with higher status versus another. See, young children, they notice and think about race. And adults are often worried about talking about it, and they fear that if we start talking about it, it will create some kind of racial bias or prejudice, when it's actually the opposite that's true. It's our silence. It's the silence about race. It's the silence about justice. It's the silence about equity that creates the misunderstanding in children, because they draw their own conclusions in their limited developmental brain. They begin to draw their own conclusions based on what they see, what they hear, the messages that they begin to interact with through their experiences. So adults play a powerful role others, as well as helping them develop a positive attitude about themselves and develop skills to promote a more just future. But only if we are willing to talk about it and to create systems that reflect it. Our mental model and our core belief is shaped by our experiences. I referenced that earlier. If we recognize how the brain develops, I use this analogy often, a lot like a seed. We as children, we can't necessarily control we can't control where our brain ends up being planted. What body, what neighborhood, what family structure, we can't control where our brain is planted. But once a brain is planted in an environment, it is the experiences that that brain encounters that it begins to grow and begin to create synaptic connections and responses to the interactions, the engagement, and the opportunity for it to feel like it belongs. So I see a note that you keep glitching in and out on occasion. Okay, so I'm hoping that it's not glitching for everyone, but I will try and keep in response to the experiences. So those experiences create what's called coping skills, coping strategies to survive the experiences that it's going. Out of those coping skills, sprout up core beliefs. Our core beliefs begin to help us understand how we fit in the world and the messages, our interpretation of the world, the people in it, and as I just shared, how we fit in that world. And based out of those core beliefs come our behaviors, our responses, how we begin to respond in response to our root system. If we think about creating experiences in the classroom that are shaping the mental models of belonging, then we have to begin to be willing to change some things. Our engagement strategies, our instructional strategies, our relationships, and yes, our storytelling. About strategies. Equity is first about the individual, its relationships, and then the system. It's an organization, as an organization and entity. If we want to seek equitable space and practices, it starts with the individual, the relationships we intentionality of creating value and honor for each person for who they are, and then provide structure and environment and resources for that person so that they can fully tap into and reach their greatest potential. Equitable organizations, they are seeking the opportunity to play a role in contributing to the long-term impact of creating a more just world. So why are we talking about these experiences and why is this messaging so important? In the middle of the pandemic, I saw these two images from Exchange Every Day. And the article shared that we are experiencing the clash between two viruses. One that has been with us for months, and another that has been with us for generations. They are glitching, they are glitching, they are clashing with one another. In our time right now, we have a clash between a pandemic of illness as well as recognizing systemic racism that has been infecting our systems, our neighborhoods, our interactions. And on our screens, we have been watching a clash between the two that have revealed something that's always been there, but now is on the forefront for not just people of color, but all people to begin to step into a space to say that we are pursuing equity. In 2020, the USA Today article shared this definition of systemic racism: the formalization of a set of institutional, historical, cultural, and interpersonal practices within a society that puts one racial, social, or ethnic group in a better position to succeed and at the same time disadvantages other groups in a consistent and constant manner. That disparities and inequities develop between the groups over a period in time. This conversation is about systems of power designed to create disadvantage. If it becomes okay to create disadvantage because of the color of someone's skin, it becomes okay to do the same for every other difference. So in the chat, I'd like for you to type in, what have you noticed in the past 16, 17 months? How have experiences of COVID-19 revealed the impact of embedded systemic inequity within the communities that you serve? Drop it into the chat. What have you noticed in just this 16 months? Lack of access to technology, increased gun violence, absolutely. Wow, they are coming through. Impact of communities, yes. Exclusion for children, availability of housing limited, yes. Higher crime, increase of gun violence, yes. Isolation, domestic violence, poverty, wow, yes. You've noticed the racism, absolutely. Food insecurities, loss of jobs, suicidality increases, yes. Drugs, yes. Drug abuse increase. If just in this 16, 18-month period in time, the blanket has been pulled off of embedded inequity that has always been there, but now it is in the forefront for all of us to recognize that we can play a role. But more importantly, we can begin to look more closely on how is this impacting the brains of children and youth and young adults. When a chronic experience of adversity takes place, it shifts. Remember that experience. When adversity is the experience that incubates the brain, when toxicity incubates the brain, it brings about a toxic stress response in the brains of children, especially all of us. But when we're talking about children, because developmentally the brain is not fully developed until well into the late 20s, possibly for some early 30s, because the brain is developing in the presence of the toxic stress, it begins to create a response of survival habits that then shift and ask how I begin to view the world I'm in through the lens of those survival habits. And then children ask the question, how will I survive? The impact, it's not momentary. It creates a lifelong impact potentially on the lives of children. The weight of embedded systemic inequity, it creates a load on the life of children, of families, of communities. And I know in one of the previous sessions from the PA Cares Partnership Project, my mentor Diane Wagenhaus and Dr. Sandra Bloom talked about allostatic load. It creates this pervasive, intensive, nonstop, relentless stress on the lives of children, families, and communities. To understand allostatic load, it is a cumulative burden of a chronic stress from life events, one thing after the other. You just listed them in the chat box. One thing after the other. But the key thing to recognize is that it doesn't stay external. It begins to change the biology and neurobiology of children, of families. It begins to create a weighted response that shifts the internal narrative that children and young people begin to respond or act out of. So if we're taking into account that this is a season and time in which we can begin to address systemic issues that don't remain external but are internally impacting the children and the families that we are called to serve, it requires us to begin to ask a very important question from our spheres of influence. In order to achieve equity, we must prioritize the interest of students and families whose interests traditionally are marginalized. Every ideology, policy, practice, and program decision should be considered through this question. I love this question from the Equity Literacy Institute. It challenges us when we are sitting at the table in places of decision-making and power. We must ask, what impact is this decision going to have on the most marginalized students and families that we have been called to serve? When we're sitting at the table, we must be willing to ask this question. Before the final decision is made, what will this decision, how will it impact the marginalized individuals? If no one is at the table asking this question, then systemic change cannot happen. And if I'm honest, based on the experiences that we're watching in front of us, that we're experiencing ourselves, that we can bear witness to from others, indifference is no longer an option. I love this quote, indifference. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it is indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it is indifference. According to Eli Wiesel, indifference is defined simply as no difference. But it's actually much more complicated and nuanced than that when we're talking about impacting the lives and making a difference in the lives of human beings who are suffering. Former Representative John Lewis's statement that it's one of my favorites, that if we know that something is not right, we are called to say something, to do something. Because if you sat in on our pre-show conversation with Nancy and I, we talked about this a little bit. because our young people, our children, are going to ask us, what did you do in that moment? What did you say in that moment? Indifference isn't an option. When I engage with clients who are asking me questions about, so how do we prepare? How do we prepare for going back into the classroom, for going back into the school setting, for going back in the fall? They often are asking me those questions and asking for advice, for coaching opportunities, for trainings. But I often first start with this question: how do you see your role in being a threat to inequity in your practices and in the experiences that children will have when they return? So if we want to talk about what space are we creating in preparation, first, I'm asking you, what role will you play in being a threat to inequity? When we talk about taking a role of engagement, I'm going to ask you 3 practical approaches. The first is, what will you learn? The first level of engagement is that of the actor. Now recognize all 3 of these roles play an important role, but there are 3 approaches to them. As the actor, it's a low risk. I recognize everyone can't jump in to the deep end, but will you take time to learn? Will you lean into a learning practice? The actor tends not to be ready to disrupt. They're watching the process. They begin to ask the questions, and we have to recognize that when high risk happens, they're going to step back. So understanding that we all play different roles in this process, and if we are willing to recognize that someone else's role may not be my role, but where can they play a role? Instead of calling people out, call them in and help them recognize what role they can play. We don't have time for indifference, and we don't have time for ostracizing. We have to call people in, not just calling them out. So the first role or opportunity is that of the actor, but the actor's desire is to learn. The second approach is living it. This role is the role of an ally. They're kind of mid-risk. They're reading, they're watching, they're identifying how to stay humble in order to lean in. They're actively engaging in conversation and making connections with others, and they're beginning to believe the experiences of others that are outside of their own. They're leaning in with the desire to not just learn information, but begin to engage in relationship because they're living it. And the third approach is lead it. This role of engagement is the accomplice. The accomplice, they're the disruptors. They're all the way in. They're willing to take the high risk because they are moving beyond just learning, and they're in it to change the system. And they're leading the charge. They're facilitating. They're walking in it to create space for others. So learn it, live it, and then lead it. 3 opportunities of recognizing where you are and where you want to be. And respecting that everyone is not going to be in the same place you are in. Create space for where someone is. Recognizing that where they are, there's opportunity. But we have to understand what zone are we operating in. The first is the comfort zone. Now, you can have action, but you can also have inaction in the comfort zone. The tricky thing about the comfort zone is that you can miss opportunities by being and resting in your comfort zone. You can create action, but you can also miss in the inaction, miss an opportunity to create an engagement or an opportunity to live out your next step. There's also the zone of the growth zone. Now, this is the on edge zone. This is not the place for comfort. Many times clients ask me to come in and facilitate the opportunity for them to get comfortable with brave conversations. And I have to pause them because it is not my role to help you remain comfortable. My role is to help you to grow. And in order to grow, you're going to have to be uncomfortable. See, in the growth zone, you're learning. You're learning about yourself. You're seeking new ways to create action, and you take risk in order to create space for others. The growth zone. But we also have to recognize that there is a space in which we call the danger zone. And for system building, sometimes we have to understand that some of the behavior you might see from a resistor is because they are in what we call their danger zone. They're scared and they withdraw or they push back. And you might even feel it within yourself. That's not the time to quit. It's recognizing I've gone into my danger zone space, but begin to ask, what do I need? Who do I need to connect with to bring me back into a place of growth? Not just quit, but recognize that we fluctuate in a pursuit of equity. We fluctuate between these zones, ultimately with the opportunity and desire to grow. So if I can give you some examples of what the roles of engagement look like, I'd like to do that. So when we talk about learn it as the role of an actor, when you're engaging in the learning process to become a threat to inequity, you're collecting and sharing resources with others around equity and its impact on children, families, and communities. So you're seeking out information. You're increasing your own awareness around someone else's value, their culture, your own bias, and creating an awareness of opportunities for potential for others. You're doing the internal work. As an actor, you're reflecting on who you want to be, how you want to be seen, and how your behavior connects or disconnects from who you are at your core. You're growing internally with a desire to connect with you. I often ask people, what do you want to be known for? The actor begins to dig into that understanding for themselves, and they explore that self-awareness through their own personal ideology, narrative, and their bias. And they identify new strategies and practices to begin to move into that growth space. So it's learn it. As an actor, you're investing in the space to learn in order to become that threat to inequity. And as you grow into a livid space, this is a space that's passionate for me as a role of the ally. You see, I am, as Nancy shared, a trainer for trauma-informed approaches. I'm a certified trainer, and I talk a lot about resilience. But when we're talking about being a threat to inequity, we must shift the sole responsibility of being resilient from the shoulders and the lives of children and families who are under the weight of marginalization. And then instead, we must create more equitable systems that eliminate the barriers that create access to equitable resources. Oftentimes, we explore this word resilience, and it's often used in an analogy around a tree. Sometimes that bamboo tree, you know that image that comes up in your mind of a bamboo tree that has been through the storm. It has been bent, it's bending and bowing. And oftentimes the analogy uses that it bounces back as though it's unchanged through the storm. But if we're honest, as human beings, we're not based on matter. We are based out of our experiences. And when we've gone through something, we're changed. We're different. So as human beings, I often say we are not bouncing back. We have to find a way to bounce forward. It's important for us to recognize that if we think about the allostatic load of families, of children who are already under that weight, if they're still standing, they are already resilient. It's an opportunity, yes, for us to continue to cultivate the understanding that resilience is not just this thing you have or you don't have. That's not what resilience is. It is actually a developmental process that is cultivated out of the opportunity for practice. It is steeped in a skill, characteristics, or attributes that come out of experiences. But as educators, for those of you who are educators in the group, if we recognize that resilience is a developmental process, that's our ball game. We have an opportunity to, yes, support them in their developmental process to become fully alive in their potential. Remember the lion? But we have to be careful in this conversation that we don't take an equity detour. Now, the Equity Literacy Institute does amazing work around this conversation in thinking about and being very careful when we're talking about resiliency, when we're talking about trauma-informed approaches, that we're careful not to take an equity detour. Because when we think about creating grit or the deficit ideology, this ideology, the deficit ideology, focuses on what do we need to help adjust in those families so that they can perform better, behave better, think differently. And if we're careful, we're putting the responsibility on the family or the student to be something without recognizing or acknowledging the inequity which is creating the behavioral response that they're trying to survive through. Grit ideology How can we help those families get grittier so that they can overcome challenges and barriers related to inequity? If we're not careful, we're again putting the responsibility of moving through space on the shoulders of those who are marginalized. Let me give you an example from the Equity Literacy Institute. This is an example. So there are several studies that show that Black students are more likely than white students to be suspended or expelled from school. So if you heard that study result, how do you interpret that fact? What meaning or assumption do you pull from that studied finding? If you interpret it as Black students have more behavior challenges than white students, or Black students can learn, but they lack the grit to become proficient in certain areas, therefore they misbehave, so they need more grit in the classroom so that their behavior becomes more subdued. If your interpretation is you can tell kids whose families don't have an education and haven't been prepared for school, if we make the mistake in taking that finding and creating an interpretation that the issue is within the student, we can potentially create a detour and miss the opportunity to address the inequity. So if I go from one of those interpretations, the next step is to create solutions for those. Well, sometimes those solutions are based on shifting and changing the student. Solutions become focused around strengthening the deficit in the student and building their grit. This belief system that locates the primary cause of the disparity in the test score, in the gap, in the academic gap, in the incarceration rate, in the poverty rate, placing it within the oppressed or pressed down, marginalized group, instead of recognizing that the solution shouldn't necessarily be about fixing the community or fixing just the student. Now, again, hear me. I study, I work in and support trauma-informed approaches, helping individuals remain healthy and whole and manage and build their responses and navigating a system that is inequitable. We want them to create and experience healing practices that support them. We absolutely want to be able to do that. Our goal is to understand that it is not solely on them. See, if we don't continue to remain focused on equity simultaneously with resilience, we may just focus on fixing the mindset, the culture, the attitude, the behavior, the grit, or the resilience without acknowledging or missing the opportunity to, at the same time, address the racial systemic inequity in the system that's creating the barrier or the response in the environment. Remember, that behavior is the symptom, it's the fruit, but it's tied to the root system. We want to be able to do both, but as a threat to inequity, we must be willing to keep our eyes close on how we are responding to the load that they are carrying and being very careful to not continue to shift the responsibility of them to just keep moving. Let's lift the weight. So a less common, but also research response to that same study pulls out the understanding that there is racial bias within teaching, the interpretation of behaviors from different cultures, from different backgrounds. The interpretation of behavioral responses among Black students is different from white students. There are several studies. I'll just share this one from 2017 in which over 1 million students, the discipline referrals were looked at. And in looking at the findings from those office discipline referrals, it was discovered that a majority of them came from a subjective office discipline referral. Those subjective responses in the discipline referral made up a vast majority of the cause for the referral. So if we're going to impact inequity, then our ideology must be one of equity ideology, so that our solutions are focused on asking better questions. We want to be able to ask the questions around what are the ideology barriers and challenges that are impacting this group? How is implicit bias and racism operating in this situation, and how do I contribute? How do I contribute to this? And how can we eliminate it? The key principle behind equity ideology is fix the injustice, not the kids. We want to be able to support them with trauma-informed approaches. We know that developmentally there is healing that can come out of practices that look at the whole. And at the same time, we must work collectively to address the issues that are creating the barrier to access and opportunity. So as we play a role as an ally, one of our roles is to solve for the stress, not just the problem. Systemic bias, cultural insensitivity from single stories, disproportionality, harsh punishments, lowered expectations, and diminished resources send a message and create a stress that becomes internalized in students.
Hey, baby.
Hey, Mom.
That's what you learned in school today.
Today I learned there's a reason the pictures in my history book are black and white. It's so we can pretend the past is past and not still present in plain sight. And so people can tell me that racism today is not really serious and not still sitting next to me in my first, second, and third period.
Today I learned I can master language like Langston. That I'm gonna grow up to earn an Emmy, Grammy, and get my Toni Morrison on. And yet, you'll still deduct points from my creative writing papers because this isn't grammatically correct.
Today, I learned in doodles, you can see creativity or disruption, self-expression or dysfunction. But the difference between detention and diagnosis of a deficit in attention is the pigmentation of that fine line between problem and potential.
Today I learned which hallways get metal detectors instead of hall monitors, police officers instead of school counselors, that you perpetually suspect I'm a suspect even though it's not my face in the news when there's another school shooting.
Today I learned I can wake up to a stressed out mom, come home to a dad dealing with things he does not have the power to speak on, that I can watch people who look like me be murdered on TV, that I can be crumbling inside. Like the foundations of the playgrounds I'm supposed to be able to play on, and the only thing anyone at school will ask me is, why didn't I do my English homework last night?
We know the names of the founding fathers.
What it takes to diagram a sentence.
How to add up all the variables of any equation.
But those are the lessons we carry with us.
So what did I learn today? Exactly what you taught me.
If we have an opportunity to acknowledge it's time to heal. It's time to heal and support the healing process of what our students are internalizing from a system of inequity. A powerful resource, and I see in the link, the desire for the video you just shared, it actually is a part of a curriculum called the Unspoken curriculum that Taraji P. Henson has launched with her foundation, the Boris Lawrence Henson Foundation. They are actively working to remove the stigma of how systemic inequity is impacting children of color and all children who are marginalized. The curriculum itself moves through intentional content for you to be able to have authentic conversations with one another. It actually provides discussion, conversation prompts to engage in dialogue, to become brave and begin to address the internalization of not feeling like they belong. But the powerful thing behind the curriculum is that it also creates an opportunity for the students themselves to engage in the conversation. It walks you through how to have the conversation, create a space so that their voices can be heard and that we can become brave in our conversations. So everyone has a stake in the mental health of children and communities that are marginalized, especially our youth. But many people do not acknowledge the implicit bias and its impact and how the disadvantaged and marginalized students must navigate it. So a sample example of some of the conversation starters within the curriculum include how can we make sure that the unspoken curriculum doesn't continue? How can we begin to be a part of this solution? The unspoken curriculum can be found at the link on the screen. You can also text no stigma to the number on the screen and receive resources as well as their e-newsletter that comes out regularly. But as an ally who's living this, we have to be willing to have the brave conversation about this and leverage our influence of power. Wherever you reside on this sphere of influence, you have access to power to those who are marginalized. And it is necessary that we begin to be brave. Oftentimes, you'll hear the conversation of creating a safe space. And originally, safe spaces were identified in the 70s for the LGBTQ community so that they had a place without shame, without fear, being able to create a space without judgment, and ultimately a space of support. And we want that for all of our students as well as ourselves. And I'm going to challenge you that before we can get to a safe space, we have to be brave. We have to engage in dialogue that is uncomfortable. We have to create space where participants feel comfortable in learning. That's why we can't continue to call people out. We have to call them in so that we can share and grow together. It's inclusive. Creating a brave conversation allows people from different backgrounds, experiences, perspectives to all come to the table and dialogue together. And it acknowledges that we're coming to the table from different perspectives. And most importantly, it holds us accountable to doing the work that is necessary for us to move into a place that we're not worried about being comfortable, but we are conscious of being brave. If we are brave, we will get to a safe space. But lastly, it requires us in those spaces to lead. And we have to shift from the superficial to the profound and be willing to ask the question, what are you willing to do to disrupt the system? So there are 4 questions, just sample questions, that I want you to begin to ask yourself as an accomplice to this work. That do all students who walk into your school, into your courtroom, into your classroom, into your building, have the opportunity to achieve, regardless of their capability, their race, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their religion, their socioeconomic status, their home language, their disability, or their identities? Do they have an opportunity to achieve? Dig in and ask that question. Ask the question, when I advocate for equity, do I take into account all types of access? Do I consider physical access as well as social, economic, and cultural access? Asking, although learning about students' individual cultures, it is valuable. Diversity is valuable, but we can't stop there. We have to commit to fighting for their rights, their equitable rights. And do I tend to find fault in students, in families, in communities that are different from mine, whether it be in poverty, whether it be from their experiences? And am I willing to address the policies, the practices, as well as the larger social factors that are creating inequitable access for them? It's time that we allow their voices to be heard and to create a shift and change opportunity for them. It's time for the internal message that they're operating from be shifted and changed to one in which they are able to access their full greatness.
Wake up, son. Wake up. You gotta wake up, son. Your future is at stake. I know. I wasn't there to wake you up.
Eat healthy now. You know, you gotta eat healthy. You won't have energy for the day. I know. I wasn't there to teach you how to make healthy choices. That's my fault.
Don't drop out. You're smart. You gotta apply yourself. You never heard me say those things. I wish you had. Wow, boy, you got talent. What college are you applying to? I know. We never dreamed together about your future.
Son, your life matters. Be big. Your face and your voice are valued.
Understand that racism still exists, and you can't really tell by the outside. You have to judge a person from the inside.
Turn it off soon. You gotta get some sleep and wake up early.
You gotta write your own story now. Make it epic.
Make it beautiful.
What are you gonna do? You're gonna drop out, be homeless, go to jail? I wish I knew. I wish I knew the next step to take. I wish I had a voice in my head to remind me to be great.
Dion, you got a big day tomorrow.
What's that?
The world needs you. You gonna show up?
I guess.
I'm already proud of you. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Miss Veirdre.
Be the voice for a foster kid.
Be that voice.
In closing, if we recognize that disparities exist at various decision points in our children's welfare, especially the systems they are engaged in, compared to white and Asian children, African American and multicultural children are more likely to be removed from their homes, spend longer time in foster care, are less likely to be adopted or reunited with their families, especially African American boys in particular, are more likely to be placed in institutional settings, experience more placement moves, and are more likely to age out of the system. We have an opportunity to be their voice for the vulnerable, for the marginalized groups. Help shape the internal dialogue and compass to help them be great. I appreciate the opportunity to share this, my passion, my hard work with you. And so now I think it's time for questions based on the time that we have left. I appreciate the chat dialogue. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. V, for such an amazing presentation. I want to remind you all that if you put your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, that we will do our best to get to each and every last one of them. Right now we have one question there, and so I'll ask it to you. What are your thoughts about the school to prison pipeline?
That is real. It is a real thing. I would love to kind of unpack the perspective on that, but it's recognizing that within our school systems, and the powerful thing, there's a longer version of this presentation that I do for K-12 environments to recognize that it's actually preschool to prison now. I want that to just sit with you for a minute. The statement is now preschool to prison pipeline. It's understanding that if the expectation is, or the implicit bias around children's behaviors, children's ability to achieve, to excel, not having equitable access, we begin from a very early age to create that box impression of how far children can go, and the expulsion rate for children that starts now in preschool begins to put them on a trajectory that limits their potential, and yes, oftentimes has them on that trajectory towards prison.
Thank you for that answer. It's funny because, as you know, I used to work in residential treatment, and it was a lot of that. You see a lot of kids, and it wasn't usually like in talking with some of my students, it's like why are you here? And they would always tell me, because I didn't go to school. And I would always say, well, what did you do to get on probation so that when you violated, you can sit here? Then they would tell me sort of the full story. But it was always one of those things that struck me that they violated probation because they didn't go to school, but you never talked about them why they weren't going to school. You know, it's always one of those things that struck me. So another question just came in, and it says, how do you start the conversation with a child about race without fear of diminishing their innocence?
So everything around this conversation around race, and we always want to be age appropriate, of course, right? So first of all, I'm going to share a resource with you that can absolutely support for younger children the conversation. So Sesame Street actually is still great. I'm like, Sesame Street, they still rock. It's awesome. So they have a website called Sesame Street in the Community, and they have an entire section around talking to your children about race, and it starts with video content. Same for older school-age children who are younger. PBS has I believe it's about an hour and a half episode entitled The Same Thing. So if you Google PBS, talking to your children about race, the whole episode gives you examples of how to engage into the conversation, and recognizing that children, first of all, we have to understand they're getting messaging. They're already hearing information. Our goal is to be able to listen and allow them to share what are they feeling, and start from what they're feeling and create space for them to process their feelings, and then share the truth of what you as a family believes, as well as helping them understand their identity and value, and then the social context. So those two resources for children are amazing, but start with addressing how they're feeling, because they already have questions.
Thank you. And Sesame Street does still rock.
They still rock, right?
Melissa asks, how could a person suggest to schools to change their websites? A lot of them only show students that compete in sports. There are way more students than the ones that are athletes.
So it's beginning the conversation with administrators. One of the things that, as a consultant, when I go into schools, we first look at messaging. So all of the messaging, from websites to brochures, to emails, to social media, what messaging do you want to put forth? Oftentimes where I begin is at the vision statement or the mission statement of the school or the school district, because it's usually some very passionate statement. And then I bring that in and say, how are you living this? How is this showing up in all avenues of the school and the messaging? What do you want to be known for as a school? Is it that you only want to be known for as your athletes? If that's not true, then let's make sure our messaging represents our full identity. So it's engaging in a conversation, asking for an opportunity to have dialogue, and providing some examples of how it can be done and be done well.
Thank you. Someone says that they're struggling currently with a stagnant workplace. Coworkers are predominantly white and lack trauma-informed practices. How can I get the ball rolling to turn this place around and to better support our community?
So, wow, that is a big question. That is a big question.
It
And
was a
I could
lot.
not possibly do it justice with a quick answer. But, you know, recognizing you have a sphere of influence, all of us. When I do leadership trainings, I ask all of the leaders to stand up in the room. And if everyone is not standing up, then I tell them, you know what? Leadership is influence. Nothing more, nothing less, from John Maxwell. You have a sphere of influence. So you start where you are and begin to talk about what is missing and how you could bring different voices to the table. Start with your sphere of influence and create traction and momentum that allows people to feel safe to engage and enter into the conversation. And then work your way out from there. As you build momentum and people realize that this isn't going to be something that you are trying to just point to what's wrong with them, but it's an opportunity for us to reflect safety. It's an opportunity for us to create a space where people feel heard and where people feel valued. It's starting where your circle of influence begins, and you have influence. I don't care what your role is, you have influence, and build out from there.
It was such a great answer for such a short answer for that question. We only have time for maybe one or two more questions. Melissa asked, as a therapist, how can I help parents and teachers understand the consequences of their conceptions and increase collaboration to benefit the child?
By listening first. So I coach home visitors literally across the state of Pennsylvania. So I have home visitors almost out on the border of Ohio, all the way over into Montgomery County. And the very first thing I encourage home visitors to do is to lean in and listen and ask parents, what kind of parent do you want to be? And then allow them to share their heart. And you're listening not to push your agenda forward, but listening to actually see them, to really hear where they are. And as you listen, it's then an opportunity to teach, to share, to be able to unpack that because they're still standing, there's still resilience in them and that they can move forward from there. But first, we have to be willing to listen. People are so tired of people with a clipboard ready to move their agenda forward. Lean in and listen first.
I think listening is like the key to almost everything. Like if we just stopped for a minute and listened to people, I think we would like really listen to people.
Really listen.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask one more question. Latoya asks, how do we prevent teachers from falling into the trap of implicit bias when reviewing student records or profiles? We know there should always be a process of relationship building before relying on the data or documents about a student, but it usually is the opposite.
So this is the growth zone moment. If you're at the table, there is no they. We are no longer waiting for them to show up or if they would do something. There is no they. It's we. It's us. It's you. If you're
Uh-oh.
Let's give her a second.
Froze.
Let's give her a second.
to not look
Here
for
she
somebody else to answer, but we become the ones who are asking the better questions.
You froze in the middle of your answer.
So I'm basically saying, you know, you have to be willing to ask the question, what's happened? How will this continue to marginalize them? And how will this create either lack of access or more access for them? There is no they we're waiting for, it's us. So we have to be willing to answer and ask those questions in those key moments. We have to be brave.
Thank you, Dr. G, for answering those questions. It is 3:00. And so we want to say thank you for such an exhilarating program and presentation today. For all of you who have been asking, you'll be able to watch it again in a couple of days. It will be uploaded to our website, pacarepartnership.org. And our final presentation of the year, we've been doing webinars for quite some time now, is Melissa Groden, and that will be on August 12th from 2:30 to 4 p.m. And we look forward to everyone joining us then. So until then, stay well, stay safe, have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. It
Thank you.
was amazing and so much needed at this time. We're grateful to have had you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.